first, which the first, which focuses on Jewish ceremonial objects, is the story of how Jews living with modernity have successfully preserved and adapted their traditional rituals and ritual objects. The second storyline tells how Jews have long been avatars and facilitators of modernity in the larger society, in literature, scholarship, performing arts, visual arts, and so on. The third narrative, and the most common, is the story of arrival, aspiration, adaptation, achievement, and acceptance. It would be hard not to notice that this third narrative has been called into question by the resurgence of anti-Semitism in America. Populist anger has also fastened on woke culture, by which is generally meant modern culture. The third main narrative, which is far and away the most insular and inward looking, seems to have avoided direct attack unless we take into account violence against synagogues. In any case, it is time for American Jewish museums to reflect on their narratives and to open themselves to new ways of thinking about the story of Jewish history in America. Beth and Hasia have kindly agreed to offer some suggestions about how our organizations might want to adopt new ways of sharing American Jewish history, both for Jews and for others. Beth, if you would lead off.
Sure. Thank you. And thanks to all of you for coming this afternoon. So I'm going to say a few things, a little bit reaching back to the past and then looking to our present moment. I will say that I think that historians are often poor evaluators of their own times, but it seems clear, I think, to all of us that we're living through some sort of inflection point in American and American Jewish history. The fact that this is the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States lends little clarity to this difficult historical moment, perhaps, but it does provide a useful occasion, I think, for reflection and an opportunity for some longue durée assessments of American and American Jewish culture. So, as I said, I can't resist a little bit of history. Anniversaries of the nation's founding have long been popular moments for Jews and other Americans to evaluate their standing in the nation, both past and present. And those of you who have ever visited Philadelphia have likely seen the massive Religious Liberty Monument that today has been moved to right outside the Weitzman Museum on Independence Mall. And I'll give you just a second. If you haven't seen it, I'll show you this quickly. I hope this looks familiar to some of you. B'nai B'rith sponsored the construction of this monument as the Jewish contribution to the centennial celebration in 1876. There's a lot to say about this monument. It's quite interesting that Jews did not honor one of their own heroes, which is what the other ethnic groups did at the centennial. But suffice it to say, this is a 25-foot statue that makes no explicit reference to Jews, but rather bears the title Religious Liberty. It depicts a female figure representing liberty, which I hope you can see here, and wearing a breastplate with the shield of the United States. She's holding the Constitution in her left hand, and her other arm extends protectively over a young male who personifies religion. So I'm just going to, take that down for a second. Why do I mention this statue? Because I think it encapsulates the standard way that Jews have publicly portrayed their devotion to the United States. These national celebrations, and there were many others later, but I'm not going to go into this, became sort of occasions for Jews to rehearse their own history and also explicate their hopes for the future, albeit in very highly selective and self-congratulatory terms. These moments also became opportunities to proclaim what Jews and Jewish culture had meant to the nation. These were highly inflated claims, usually underscored with two primary themes. The first centered on Jewish contributions to the United States in all sorts of fields, but there was always a particular veneration of Jewish war service and patriotism. The second theme emphasized the biblical roots of American culture, identifying Jews as the progenitors of monotheism, recipients of the Old Testament, whose values somehow became the formation of American life. These embellished claims that have a grain of truth, but they're embellished in the celebrations I'm talking about, proved very durable and long lasting. Generation after generation of Jewish communal leaders assisted in Judaism's founding role in democracy and the symmetry of American and Jewish values. And I've written about this elsewhere and tried to explain that this was a Jewish construction in the sense that the repeated insistence of a kind of seamless line between, right, from the Torah to the Constitution was part aspirational and part inspired by some fear that it might not be so. I mean, let me go back to that monument, right? It's the centennial, it's 1876. Jews are dedicating that religious liberty sculpture. But what else is going on in the United States? It was a time, just to take one example, when many Christian groups had lobbied to pass a constitutional amendment acknowledging the nation's dedication to Christian principles. It was called the Christian Amendment, which ultimately did fail in Congress. But it deeply unsettled many Jews. And if you read the papers around this from the time, you can see that. And in fact, when the monument was dedicated in Philadelphia, a few of the speeches spoke directly to those fears. And what they did, instead of saying, we're so afraid this will go away, instead they had many confident proclamations about American liberty. But those heightened proclamations really reflected a kind of undercurrent of anxiety and insecurity that's been a constant thread in American Jewish history. I appreciate why Jews felt the need to make these pronouncements. And it's really did help Jews to formulate a popular history of their own stories on American soil. But as we approach the 250th anniversary of the nation, I already see some of that same rhetoric surrounding some of the commemorations right now. And we might want to think about that formulation and how we balance different factors that have affected American Jewish life. For so long, Jews have clung to a very now outdated belief that America is different. That mantra, America is different, rests on an interpretation of the United States as offering a wholly distinct experience from previous Jewish histories, particularly European ones. And at the heart of these assessments lay claims that American Jews faced neither the struggle for emancipation nor the virulent political anti-Semitism that gripped parts of Europe. According to this paradigm, these differences allowed Jewish immigrants to assimilate successfully, blend their ethnic and national identities more seamlessly than Jews in other countries had ever been able to do. American exceptionalism, which, by the way, existed broadly in America and also among American Jews, served as a broad explanatory framework for everything from Jewish mobility to educational and cultural attainments to economic and political success and more. It's an idea that's definitely been cemented as a trope in American Jewish culture. But I'm going to ask as we enter this 250th moment if maybe it's worn out its usefulness for us as a community. We are living in a time when history itself is under assault. And I think we could ask more in our reflections of the American and the American Jewish past. And I really want to be clear, it's not because we ought to be casting aspersions on the United States. a country that did offer tremendous opportunities and greater liberties than most Jews had known elsewhere. Still, I'd like to see Jewish organizations move away from contribution history, right? Look what we did for America. Look how our biblical texts informed American democracy, and instead more thoughtfully engage with the real complexities of American Jewish life. Jews have long known about the fragility of rights. And a good deal of American exceptionalism was about how America gave us all this freedoms and equality, and they're unmovable. And many Jews are today shocked at the backlash that they feel in what's going on. And this might be a perfect time to reflect about on the contingencies of freedoms and the delicacy of democratic societies. We might think not only about what Jews contributed or accomplished and consider what American Jews shared with others, migration experiences, the challenge of minority existence, refugee status at moments in Jewish history, and diasporic connections abroad. And when we talk about anti-Semitism, which I'm sure will be a major theme in this next year, we should think about the larger context that allows such worldviews to grow. Anti-Semitism targets Jews, but it usually bubbles up in moments of some kind of societal dislocation or dysfunction. So I'll just say in closing, because we live in such a precarious moment in history, I think Jewish communities have a kind of opportunity to grapple with our multidimensional American Jewish histories. And it's an opportunity to challenge tropes and engage very difficult questions. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for that wonderful set of remarks. Hasia?
Okay, well, I will, as Beth did, begin by thanking Avi for including me in this, and I wish this were in person and I could actually be literally talking to all of you and hearing from you. But so be it. So I'm going to pick up on some words that were included in Avi's introductory remarks and some things that Beth hinted at, particularly towards the end of her presentation. So, and I hope that nobody will take this to be a criticism of how American Jewish museums are constituted. It is just sort of, one might say, since this is a talking circle, my talking about what I'd like to see as a remolding or a rethinking not only of the museums, but in fact the way in which we, American Jewish historians, write the history. So it is almost by necessity that a museum that's called a Jewish museum, the Jewish Museum of this place and that place, be it particularly a specific city as well as the National Museum of American Jewish History, the nation as a whole, by definition, it's going to have a siloed approach. It's going to be about Jews. Jews did this and Jews did that. Jews remolded their tradition from A to B to C, but always Jews remained loyal to some context. Jews lived in particular places. Jews built certain institutions. Jews inhabited certain public institutions, used particular streets. Jews participated in the in American culture, be it at the most vernacular and popular level, and at the highest level. Jews participated in American politics and the like. So I probably don't have to go on any further. What to me is very striking in not only, again, the museums I visit as a tourist or the museums I have worked with as a consultant, but also much of the scholarship as we have written it, is that Jews are alone. Okay. And other people, and Avi used the word others, Beth used the word others, other people come in a way as antagonists. Okay. It's not just that their stories are not represented, but the multiple ways in which their presence shaped the lives and the of Jews is completely gone or is completely absent. And so that we know that Jews came to the United States. They never lived in splendid isolation. They lived in streets, on block, in apartment buildings, and on streets, in neighborhoods, and then in cities in which they rubbed shoulders with, jostled with, and came to some kind of changing, but still accommodation with all sorts of other people. The histories of those other people deeply impacted the ways in which Jews define themselves as Americans and indeed even as Jews. In other words, Jews were not the isolated shapers of their own identities or the architects of their own existence. And so, in every place they lived, in every institution in which they functioned, and one might even mention within synagogues, because we know that so much of Jewish religious practice in America was impacted by what their non-Jewish neighbors did in their houses of worship. We don't have those stories incorporated into, again, our scholarship and in public manifestations or popular manifestations of this historical narrative. So that I want to think about this in two different ways. And one is just the question of proximity. And the fact that Jews lived with other people, they attended schools with other people, they had teachers who were who represented other ethnic, religious communities. They worked in places where non-Jews became their co-workers, the people with whom they may have sat at the lunch table during the break, who may have chatted with in downtime and learned from each other. Jews in the American political system never entered into debates and pursued their agenda on their own. They couldn't. They were too small a number to be able to chart or to create a path from having a political goal and having it realized without having to go into some kind of alliance with other people. And so the fact of that proximity and the complexity of those relationships, again, those are the two issues that I really see as lacking in much of, again, and it's not just the museums. So the museums are really a reflection of the way the scholarship has been written, is something that I think as we look to a multicultural future. Okay, we look at a world in which Jews are, in fact, a declining part of the American population. Okay, that we find those ways or those points of intersection in which we can tell the Jewish story as they lived with and acted in concert with others, and not necessarily sometimes in a formal political way, but often just in terms of the kinds of practices that they engaged with on a daily basis or in a much larger sense. And so I'm going to just offer a couple examples, and I will talk a little bit about a project that I had been involved with, but I see this as just slightly emblematic. But first, I'm going to begin actually with one of my PhD students who is herself from Shanghai, and she's writing a dissertation on the Jewish encounter with the Chinese in America through the medium of food. Okay, now there was a few years ago an excellent exhibit that toured the country on Jews in Mahjong. Okay, and Shi Young's dissertation is going to take this into a practice that has been so universally observed among American Jews or about American Jews, which is a kind of interest in and orientation towards the consumption of Chinese food, particularly at certain ritual moments, Sundays, okay, and then the big one on Christmas. Okay, so here we have a way in which Jews lived that we can't understand it by looking at Jews or Jews only, but we have to look at it in relationship to this dialogue with Chinese restaurateurs. And this is not a plug for Xiang's work, but it's still going to be remarkable that these Chinese restaurateurs recognized, well, here's a population to whom we can advertise and market. And they specifically place advertisements in Jewish newspapers, both Yiddish and English. Okay, so the Jewish pattern of consumption and marking their year is shaped by someone else. Okay, so what an opportunity to look at those other places where these two populations had something that where their histories overlapped. And again, we can see that it was of interest to both of both groups to do this. I recently worked on a project on rethinking the Irish-Jewish encounter in America. And contrary to the overwhelming truth in the field of this as an encounter between Jewish victims and Irish anti-Semites, rather a number of really fascinating stories just flew out of the archives and of cooperation, of ways in which I had actually intended to subtitle the book, although the publisher changed it, the way the Irish helped the Jews learn to become American through the medium of the labor movement, through the political machine, and for something as formative in American Jewish life as public education, where in the years of the great Jewish migration to the United States, the majority of school teachers were Irish Catholic women, the daughters of one generation removed from immigrant parents. So when a museum or again some other vehicle of telling the Jewish story talks about Jewish success in education, okay, the Jewish use of public schools, what has historically been blotted out is the fact that somebody was teaching them. Okay, and that those individuals who came from a very different background molded and shaped the Jewish path into that big story we tell of integration and success. Okay, so I think that that is sort of a way in which, and I understand that museums are eager and should be to diversify their audiences. Here is one way to rethink the narrative, okay, which is to look at what are the points of intersection. A museum that occupies a city in which there were in a city that in which there were Italian neighborhoods and Polish neighborhoods and Irish and Chinese, and obviously the connection with African Americans is one that is begging to be told in museum status. In a museum framework, it may have some unpleasant and uncomfortable moments, but one should never shy away from those, but rather talk about how the history of the Jews in the United States was a history shaped by other people as well as by Jews themselves. In that note, I think we, again, as we write and as we present American Jewish history, we need to be conscious of just the vast diversity of the American population. And at no time were Jews even in New York City, such a large percentage that we could say they defined public life, but rather, it was about the extent and the depth and the breadth of that diversity. And so, just one statistic I'm going to throw out, and I'm going to draw this then to a close because I've been pretty clear about what concerns me about the way the scholarship has existed and the public presentations, is that in 1900, 80% of all of Chicago were either immigrants or their children. It meant that Jews were not any different, okay, than anyone, than again, the vast majority of the Chicago population of people who had come from someplace else, who had roots in other societies, who maintained relationships to other places, who found ways to celebrate their culture, who struggled with English, who jostled in the public sphere for their agendas. And Jews were part of this complex American mosaic. Okay, and I would like to see, again, how American Jewish history is presented, be it in the scholarship or, again, in these public venues and public modes with that complicated and richer story. Thank you.
Hasia, thank you very much. Beth, would you care to respond in any way to Hasia's remarks as an opener?
No, I mean,